My ex-husband was celebrating with his family. They froze when I pulled up in a Lamborghini. Chapter 1. What love was supposed to feel like. I keep the keys to a black Lamborghini in a ceramic bowl by my front door now, right next to my daughter's hair ties and a chipped magnet shaped like the state of Texas. People who see it assume I was born into ease, that the leather seats and the low, throaty engine are proof of good luck. They're wrong. That car sits 12 feet from a jelly jar full of grocery store carnations my daughter picked out herself last Tuesday, because both things are true about my life now. I built something, and I never once forgot where I started, but this isn't a story about a car. It's a story about the year everyone I loved decided I wasn't worth the trouble of believing. So let me start where it actually began, 9 years ago, in a half-finished model home off Slaughter Lane, with sawdust still clinging to the baseboards and a man in a hard hat who couldn't stop staring at a bowl of fake lemons. I was 23, working for a home staging company that furnished Brown Builders model units around South Austin. My job was simple: make an empty house feel like somebody's future. I'd learned from 2 years at Austin Community College and a lifetime of watching my mother stretch a grocery budget into something that still looked like abundance. That the right lemons in the right bowl could make a stranger fall in love with drywall. Paul Brown walked through that model home like he owned it, because in a way he did. His father's company had built it, but he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at my lemons like they'd personally offended him. "Those aren't real," he said. "No kidding." I didn't look up from the throw pillows I was arranging. "Neither is the fireplace. It's gas. Neither is half the granite. It's quartz with a good publicist." He laughed, and it wasn't the practice laugh men in expensive boots gave staging girls they had no intention of remembering. It came out of him surprised, like I'd caught him off guard. "I'm Paul," he said. "I'm supposed to be checking punch list items. Instead, I'm getting lectured about lemons by someone who clearly runs this house better than my father's superintendent does." "Jeannie," I said, "and I'm not lecturing. I'm saying, if you want people to believe this is a home and not a spreadsheet, you don't put silk hydrangeas in a Texas kitchen in July. Nobody who actually lives here would do that. You put in something that looks like it survived the heat." He crouched down right there in his pressed shirt and studied the bowl like I'd handed him a puzzle worth solving. "What would you put instead?" "Limes. Real ones if your budget can handle $11 a bag. People trust a house more when it looks like somebody just made a margarita in it." He came back 3 days later with a bag of limes from the H-E-B on Menchaca Road and set it on the counter without a word, like he was submitting evidence in a case he intended to win. That was Paul in the beginning. He didn't say the big things out loud. He just showed up with limes. We spent the next year doing the kind of ordinary things that turn out later to be the ones you remember most. He taught me to parallel park his truck in an empty lot off Berkman Drive badly, both of us laughing too hard to focus on the mirrors. I taught him the difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative one, which came in handier at his father's job sites than either of us expected. We swam at Barton Springs on the hottest Saturdays of the summer, the water cold enough to steal your breath, and talked for hours about nothing that mattered and everything that did. He told me about growing up in a house where love got measured against achievement. I told him about growing up in a house where love never ran short, even in years when the pantry did. Neither of us tried to fix the other's childhood. We just listened, the way people listen when they've already decided they want to know everything. He proposed on the pedestrian bridge over Lady Bird Lake at sunset. No ring-box theatrics, just his hand shaking a little as he pulled his grandmother's ring from his jacket pocket and told me he'd rather build an ordinary life with me than an extraordinary one with anyone else. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Neither of us thought to wonder yet whether an ordinary life was something his family would actually allow him to choose. That engagement landed 14 months after our first meeting in that model home. But the panic that came with it had nothing to do with the ring on my finger. Loving Paul Brown meant eventually sitting across a table from his mother, Elizabeth Brown had a way of looking at a person like she was pricing them. We had dinner at her house in Westlake, the kind with a wine room and a housekeeper named Dolores, whom Elizabeth introduced by first name and then never spoke to again for the rest of the evening. I wore the nicest dress I owned, a navy sheath I'd bought on clearance and altered myself. And I watched Elizabeth's eyes catalogue every seam. Jeannie Greer, she said, turning my name over like she was checking it for a defect. And your people are from Windsor Park. Born and raised, I said. My mother's worked cafeteria service for Austin ISD for 26 years. She makes the best chicken and dumplings in Travis County. And she'll tell you so herself if you give her half a chance. Henry Brown, Paul's father laughed at that, a real laugh, and topped off my water glass himself, instead of waiting on Dolores. I liked him instantly. He had Paul's same habit of showing care through small practical actions instead of speeches. Paul's younger sister Samantha sat across from me, trying, I could tell, to figure out where I fit. She was 26 then, sharp-eyed, already selling real estate on the side of a marketing job she didn't love. And she asked me decent questions about the staging business, actual questions, the kind that meant she was listening for the answer instead of waiting for her turn to talk. I liked her too, cautiously, the way you like someone whose loyalty you can't yet locate. Elizabeth did not laugh. She smiled the way people smile in photographs they don't want taken, and said, "How lovely. Community really does raise a person, doesn't it? It wasn't cruel enough to fight. It was only cool enough to remember." After dinner, while Paul helped his father carry dessert plates to the kitchen, Elizabeth found me alone on the back patio, looking out at a pool lit up blue against the dark. She stood close enough that her perfume, something expensive and floral, made my clearance rack dress feel even cheaper against my skin. "I like you, Jeannie," she said. "I do. You're clever, and you clearly love my son. I do love him. Love isn't always enough, though. Not in this family." She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the pool like she was speaking to the water instead of to me. This family has a way of doing things, a way of being seen. Paul has responsibilities ahead of him that most young men his age don't carry. Responsibilities like that require a partner who understands the weight of them, not just the romance. "I understand weight," I said, and I meant it, thinking of my mother's swollen feet after a double shift. My father's funeral 8 years earlier. The exact sound a refrigerator makes when it's nearly empty and you're pretending it isn't. I've been carrying it my whole life. Elizabeth finally turned and looked at me directly, and for one unguarded second, something crossed her face that might have been respect, or might have been calculation. I never did learn to tell the difference with her. "I hope you're right," she said. "I truly do. Because if this doesn't work, Jeannie, it won't only be Paul's heart at stake. It will be everything this family has spent decades building. I hope you know what you're getting into." Behind her, through the glass doors, Paul was laughing at something his father said, a dish towel slung over one shoulder, utterly unaware that his mother had just handed me a warning wrapped inside a compliment. I smiled at Elizabeth like I hadn't understood the threat folded into her words. Because I was 24 and in love and certain, the way only the young and in love can be certain, that whatever weight she meant I could carry it. On the drive home that night, Paul reached over and laced his fingers through mine at every red light on Cave Road, the way he always did, like it was a habit his hands had formed before his mind caught up to it. I didn't tell him what his mother had said on the patio. I told myself I was protecting him from having to choose between us, though the truth, if I'm honest, all these years later, was simpler than that. I was afraid that if I said it out loud, I'd have to actually look at it. I had no way of knowing yet how heavy that silence would get, or how many hands would set it down and walk away the moment it mattered most. Chapter 2. The Weight of Being Chosen. We married on a Saturday in April, in a garden venue off Cave Road with bluebonnets still holding on at the edges of the lawn. My mother cried through the entire ceremony, the kind of crying that comes from relief as much as joy, because she'd spent years afraid nobody would ever choose her daughter the way she deserved to be chosen. Elizabeth Brown did not cry. She sat in the front row in ivory, which the wedding planner had gently asked her 3 separate times not to wear, and smiled with her mouth only. I didn't care. I had Paul's hand in mine, and his grandmother's ring on my finger, and for one full day, none of the rest of it touched us. We rented a 2-bedroom off Manor Road, nowhere near Westlake, because Paul wanted us to build something ourselves before his family's money ever touched our life. I filled it with furniture I found at estate sales and refinished myself. A second-hand dining table I sanded down to raw pine and stained the color of strong coffee, curtains I sewed on my mother's old machine. Paul used to come home from Brown Builders, loosen his tie, and just stand in the doorway some nights, looking at what I'd made out of almost nothing. "You should be doing this for a living," he said once, running his hand along the table's edge. "Not staging model homes for my dad's company. This, your own thing. Someday," I said. And I meant it the way you mean a wish on a birthday candle, not a plan with a deadline attached. Zoe came 17 months later, 3 weeks early, and furious about it. 7 pounds of pure defiance, who screamed through her first hour of life like she had complaints about the whole arrangement. Paul held her in the recovery room at St. David's Medical Center and cried harder than I'd ever seen a grown man cry. And I remember thinking, watching him, that whatever else happened in our life, we had built this one perfect thing together, and nobody could take it from us. Those first months blurred into a rhythm made of 2 a.m. feedings and half-finished sentences. Paul took the 6 a.m. shift so I could sleep an extra hour every single morning without being asked twice. He'd learned to swaddle her tighter than I ever could, some engineer's instinct in his hands for corners and folds. I remember rocking her on the back porch of our little rental while the sun came up over Manor Road, so exhausted I could barely see straight, and still so certain I was exactly where I was supposed to be that the certainty felt like its own kind of rest. Henry threw us a dinner 2 months after Zoe was born, a real one. The whole family gathered at the Westlake house, and he invited an old friend, a semi-retired architect named Alexander Ross, who'd worked alongside him on some of Brown Builders' earliest projects decades back. Alexander was in his 60s, silver-haired, married to a wife named Patricia, who'd stayed home with a cold that night, and he had the kind of quiet attentiveness that made you feel like the only person in a crowded room. He ended up seated beside me at the far end of the table, well outside Elizabeth's orbit. "Henry tells me you did all the work on your place yourselves," he said, cutting into his chicken. "The table, the curtains, all of it, most of it. Second-hand and stubbornness," he laughed, warm around the edges. "I've spent 40 years watching people pay decorators $40,000 to fake the eye you clearly have naturally. You ever think about doing this professionally? Design, renovation, that kind of work?" "I think about it," I admitted. "I don't have the money to think about it seriously. Money's the easiest part to fix. If the eye's already there." He pulled a business card from his jacket pocket and slid it across the tablecloth, like it was nothing at all. "If you're ever serious, call me. I know where the bones of a good building are hiding under an ugly one. You clearly know how to dress it once you find it. We'd make a decent team." I tucked the card into my dress pocket and told myself I'd think about it later. The way you tell yourself you'll water a plant you've already half forgotten. At the head of the table, Henry was telling Alexander about a lawsuit scare on a strip mall renovation from a decade back, waving it off with the easy confidence of a man who'd survived worse. "That's the business," he said. "You put up enough buildings, eventually one of them tries to bite you. Riverside Commons is going to be the big one, though. 22 stories downtown. I'm handing the whole project to Paul once we break ground. Sink or swim." Paul, across the table, smiled like a man accepting a compliment, and I didn't yet understand what that weight would cost him to carry, quietly, alongside everything else he already carried for us without ever once complaining. Down the table, Elizabeth was holding Zoe up toward the window light for a photo, and I heard her say to a cousin visiting from Houston, "She has the brown nose, thank goodness." Skipped right over the other side. Paul heard it too. I watched his jaw tighten, watched him open his mouth to say something and then close it again. Because Henry was mid-story about the Riverside Commons groundbreaking, a new mixed-use tower downtown that Brown Builders had just won the bid on. And the whole table's attention had already drifted past his mother's comment without him. That was the pattern I'd come to learn that I didn't have the vocabulary for yet. Elizabeth said something sharp. Someone noticed. Nobody stopped the table to name it. The moment just kept moving, carrying the hurt along underneath it like current under a calm surface. After dinner, while Paul loaded gifts into the car and Henry walked Alexander out, Elizabeth found me in the kitchen, rinsing a bottle at the sink. "You've done well for yourself, Jeannie," she said. And for a moment I let myself believe it was a real compliment. Better than I expected, honestly. "Paul seems happy." "He is." "We are." She dried her hands on a dish towel, folded it into a precise rectangle, set it down exactly where it had been. "You know, the Junior League is starting their fall class of new members soon. It would be good for you, good for Paul standing at the company too, honestly, if you had something of your own to be part of. Something suitable." "I have something of my own," I said, thinking of the business card in my dress pocket, the shape of it against my hip like a small secret promise I hadn't decided to keep yet. "I'm still figuring out what it looks like." Elizabeth smiled that photograph smile again. "Of course you are, dear. There's no rush." But her eyes moved over my sink-wet hands, my department store cardigan. The exhausted circles under my eyes, and I understood. The way you understand weather before it arrives. That in her mind there was absolutely a rush. And I was already behind on it. That night, driving home with Zoe asleep in her car seat and Paul humming along to the radio beside me, I slipped Alexander's card into the zippered pocket of my diaper bag, tucked behind a spare pacifier where Paul would never think to look. Not because I was hiding anything shameful, but because I wasn't ready yet to explain a dream I hadn't finished believing in myself. Once Zoe was down for the night and the house had gone quiet, Paul found me in the kitchen, scrubbing a bottle that was already clean. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, chin resting on top of my head. "She means well," he said, "in her own complicated way. She thinks I'm not enough for this family. She thought that about me too once. First year I worked for Dad, I missed a deadline on a permit filing, cost us 3 weeks on a project. She told him, straight to his face, that maybe I wasn't cut out for the business after all. He turned me around gently, so I had to look at him. People say things when they're scared, Jeannie. My mother's whole life is scared of somebody deciding this family isn't as solid as it looks. That's hers to carry, not yours. And if I never convince her, then you don't convince her." He kissed my forehead, easy, certain of it. "You already convinced the only Brown whose opinion actually runs this house." I believed him completely, standing there in that small kitchen with dish soap still drying on my hands. I did not yet understand that being right about his mother's fear would not stop that same fear from eventually finding its way into his own mouth. In his own words, on a night neither of us could see coming yet, 11 days later. On a Tuesday, while Zoe napped, I dialed the number on the back of that card. It became the first decision I made entirely for myself since the day I said I do. It also, though nothing in that quiet Tuesday afternoon could have warned me, set into motion the exact sequence of events that would end my marriage before that same year ran out. Chapter 3. The House on Avenue F. Alexander answered on the second ring, like he'd been expecting me to take longer than 11 days, and was pleasantly surprised I hadn't. "Jeannie Brown," he said. "I was starting to think Henry's dinner parties had scared you off design entirely. It's Greer, still, professionally," I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came out. "And no. I've just been raising a 2-month-old who doesn't believe in sleep as a concept." He laughed and told me to meet him Thursday morning. If I could manage it at a house on Avenue F in Hyde Park. I arranged for my mother to watch Zoe, told Paul I had a staging consultation that ran long, which was not exactly a lie, just not the whole truth either, and drove north into one of the oldest neighborhoods in Austin. Live oaks arching over the street like the whole block had agreed to keep a secret together. The house was a 1920s bungalow that had been empty for 2 years, its porch sagging on one side, its paint peeling in long curls off the clapboard siding. A for sale sign leaned crooked in the overgrown yard. The price on it low enough that I did the math twice in my head before I trusted it. Structurally, "She's sound," Alexander said, running his hand along the porch railing the way you'd check a horse's leg. "Original heart pine floors under that carpet, if I had to guess. Good bones under bad choices. That's most of Hyde Park, honestly, and most people too, if you look hard enough. We walked through it for 2 hours. He showed me how to spot foundation problems from hairline cracks in the drywall, how to read a roofline for water damage, how to estimate a renovation budget without getting robbed by the first contractor who smelled money on you. I took notes on the back of a grocery receipt because I hadn't thought to bring anything better, and by the time we locked up, my hands were shaking with an excitement I hadn't let myself feel about anything just for me in longer than I could remember. "You could buy this," Alexander said, watching my face. "Not someday, now. What would that take?" I thought about the small life insurance payout that had come after my father died. Money I'd never touched, sitting untouched in a savings account like a wound I didn't want to reopen by spending it. $14,000. Enough for a down payment if I was careful. Enough to make my father's death mean something other than just an absence. If I could turn it into a beginning instead, I think I could actually do this, I said. Then do it quietly. Learn as you go, and don't tell a soul until you've got something to show them, Alexander said. People love to talk you out of a risk before you've proven it was worth taking. I told myself that was good advice, not an excuse, and for the next 6 weeks I believed it completely. I didn't tell Paul, not because I thought he'd stop me, but because Riverside Commons had swallowed him whole. The lawsuit over the parking structure's drainage system had ballooned into a dispute with the city. Inspectors crawling the site twice a week, Henry short-tempered and short-staffed, and leaning on his son harder than I thought was fair. Paul came home most nights, with his tie already loosened before he hit the driveway, ate dinner half listening, fell asleep some nights still in his work clothes with Zoe's monitor crackling on the nightstand. I didn't want to hand him one more thing to worry about. I wanted to hand him something finished, something that proved I could carry weight too, not just witness his. One night in September, I almost told him anyway. We were lying in bed, Zoe finally asleep in the next room, and Paul was staring at the ceiling with the particular stillness he got when Riverside Commons was chewing on him, even in the dark. "Sometimes I think you married the wrong Brown," he said, only half joking. "My dad's version of me. The one who doesn't miss deadlines or panic about drainage easements at 2 in the morning. I married exactly the Brown I wanted," I said, and I meant it enough that the words came out steady. "I like watching you figure things out. I like that it's hard for you sometimes and you do it anyway." He turned his head on the pillow to look at me, and for a second I almost said it. Almost told him about Avenue F, about Alexander, about the $14,000 of my father's death that I'd finally spent on something instead of guarding it like a wound. But he looked so tired, and the number on the drainage fix was still sitting unresolved in my chest like a stone I hadn't found anywhere to set down, and I thought, not tonight. I'll tell him once it's fixed. Once I have good news, instead of one more problem to hand him. I have relived that decision more times than I can count in the years since. Not because it was wrong exactly, because it was so reasonable, so kind, so entirely in character for the woman I was back then, that I never once saw it as the fork in the road it actually was. So I met Alexander at the house on Avenue F3, sometimes 4 times a week on my lunch break, on Saturday mornings while Paul took Zoe to his parents, in the gaps of a life that was otherwise entirely accounted for by other people's needs. I learned to pull permits at the city office on Nueces Street. I learned the difference between a load-bearing renovation and a cosmetic one, this time with my hands actually on the studs instead of just Paul's hand on a dining table I'd sanded. I learned how badly it could hurt when a contractor I hired to redo the plumbing quoted me one price and then, 3 days into the job, doubled it, and how good it felt to fire him on the spot and find someone honest instead. By September, I could look at a water stain on a ceiling and tell you, within a few $100s, what it would cost to fix the roof above it. I could talk to a lumber supplier on Burnett Road without flinching when he tried to quote me the price he reserved for people who didn't know any better. Alexander started introducing me to people as my new partner instead of Henry's daughter-in-law, and the first time he said it, standing in the framing lumber aisle of a supply yard with sawdust on my sneakers, something in my chest unlocked that I hadn't realized had been shut tight since the night Elizabeth Brown asked me about the Junior League. Samantha found me there on a Tuesday in October, though I didn't know it yet. She was showing a listing 2 doors down, her real estate lanyard still around her neck, and she watched from across the street as Alexander and I stood in the front yard studying a soil report, his hand landing briefly on my shoulder when I sighed in frustration over the cost of the drainage fix the inspector had just flagged. I didn't see her. I was too busy trying not to cry over $4,000 I didn't have, and Alexander was too busy being kind about it. The exact kind of grandfatherly kindness a person offers when they've spent 40 years watching. Young women get told their ambitions are cute, right up until the moment those ambitions become inconvenient. What I didn't know, standing in that overgrown yard with dirt on my knees and a soil report in my shaking hands, was that Samantha had seen enough. Not the whole picture, just a piece of it. The piece that fit easiest into a story she already half believed, because some part of her had never fully let go of her mother's certainty that I didn't quite belong in this family, that I was, at bottom, a little too eager, a little too hungry, a little too willing to take what wasn't fully offered to her yet. She saw me there again the following week, and the week after that, always with the same silver-haired man, always close together over papers spread across a porch railing or a truck tailgate. Samantha had spent her whole life being the daughter who came second to Paul, the one who'd had to fight twice as hard for half the praise. And some unexamined part of her had decided long ago that the family's approval was a finite thing, that whatever I took of it, she lost. She didn't ask me about it. She didn't ask Alexander, whom she'd have recognized from Henry's dinner table if she'd let herself think it through. She carried it instead to her mother first, the way people carry the things they're not sure they're allowed to feel certain about, looking for someone to grant them permission to believe the worst. I didn't find any of that out until much later, sitting across a table from Paul with the whole truth spread between us like a map neither of us had thought to check before we started the drive. But that Tuesday in October, 3 weeks before everything fell apart, Samantha Brown sat in her car outside a for sale sign that no longer said for sale, picked up her phone and dialed her brother's number, already rehearsing in her head exactly how she was going to say it so that it would land the way she needed it to land. Chapter 4. What he chose to believe. I got the good news on a Wednesday. The city inspector, who'd flagged the drainage easement on Avenue F, called to say a revised survey put the fix at $1,100, not $4,000, a clerical error on the original report that had cost me 3 sleepless weeks for nothing. I drove home practically vibrating with it, already composing the sentence in my head, "Paul, I need to tell you something," already picturing his face when he understood what I'd built while he wasn't looking. I called my mother from the car, still 6 minutes from home, just to say it out loud to somebody. "The number's not 4,000, Mama. It's 1,100. I can still make this work." She laughed the real laugh, the one that meant she was proud, even though she still didn't fully understand what I'd been building on Avenue F for 2 months. Only that it mattered to me, and that had always been enough for her. I hung up feeling lighter than I had in weeks, already rehearsing how I'd tell Paul, already picturing the relief on his face once he understood I hadn't been keeping a secret so much as guarding a surprise. He was standing in the kitchen when I walked in, still in his work clothes, a glass of water untouched in front of him like he'd poured it and then forgotten why. "Hey," I said, dropping my bag on the counter. "I have something to tell you. Something good, actually, finally, and I think you're going to... Where have you been going?" The question landed strange, too flat, too rehearsed. I stopped with my hand still on the counter. "What? 3-4 times a week for 2 months. Where have you been going, Jeannie?" My first instinct, God help me, was relief, because I thought he'd found out, that he already knew about Avenue F somehow, and I could finally stop carrying it alone. "Okay," I said, and I actually smiled. "Okay. This is actually perfect timing, because I was just about to... Samantha saw you." His voice cracked slightly on saw, the only sign of how hard this was for him. "With some guy, older, silver hair, at a house in Hyde Park. She's seen you 3 separate times, Jeannie, and you never once mentioned a house in Hyde Park to me." Everything in me went very still. "His name is Alexander Ross," I said. "He's Henry's friend. He was at Zoe's dinner, remember? He's teaching me the renovation business. I bought a house, Paul, on Avenue F. I've been fixing it up on weekends, learning the trade, and I was going to tell you the second the drainage problem was solved, because I didn't want to hand you one more half-finished thing while Riverside Commons was already eating you alive." "How old is he?" Paul asked. 63. Married 38 years to a woman named Patricia, who makes the best pecan pie I've ever put in my mouth. He has 3 grandchildren and a hip that acts up when it rains. He's teaching me how to read a foundation report, Paul. That's the whole of it. Then why hide it? Because I wanted to hand you something finished, not something half-built that you'd have one more reason to worry about. I watched him try to fit that explanation into whatever shape Samantha had already carved in his mind, and I watched it not quite fit. "You bought a house," he repeated. "By yourself? With money I didn't know you had. And you've been meeting a man there in secret for 2 months, and you're telling me now only because I asked. I'm telling you because it's true. There's a difference, is there?" His jaw was tight, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the 22 stories of steel and lawsuits sitting on his shoulders. And I understood, even in that moment, that I was not fighting with Paul. I was fighting with everything Paul hadn't slept through in 3 months. Because from where I'm standing, my wife has been lying to me for 2 months, and the only reason I'm hearing the truth now is because my sister happened to drive past. I wasn't lying. I was surprising you. There's a difference between that too, if you'd let there be. Convenient difference. That word convenient hit somewhere low and mean. I felt the hurt of it turn almost instantly into anger. Because being accused of something you didn't do has its own particular sting. A sting that makes you want to defend the wound instead of the facts. "I need you to understand something," I said, forcing my voice level. "You could have called me. Any afternoon, any single one of the last 2 months, you could have called and asked where I was, and I would have told you the truth, all of it, right then. Instead, you let your sister plant something in your head, and you let it sit there however many days, and you never once picked up the phone and just asked your wife a direct question. I didn't want to hear you lie to me. Then you should have been more scared of hearing me tell the truth, because that's exactly what you're getting right now, and you still don't fully believe it. You want to ask me if I'm having an affair, Paul? Ask me, say the actual words. Don't stand in my kitchen throwing convenient at me like I owe you an apology for building something without asking your permission first. Did I say affair? You didn't have to. It's all over your face." He didn't answer that. He just looked at me. And in the silence, I watched something in him give way, not to reason, but to every quiet fear he'd carried his whole life about not being enough to hold on to what mattered. A fear I'd have recognized instantly if it hadn't been my own name attached to the accusation instead of his. "Maybe my mother was right about you from the start," he said. The kitchen went perfectly silent. Somewhere down the hall, the baby monitor crackled with the small, even sounds of Zoe sleeping through the worst moment of her parents' marriage without any idea it was happening. Say that again, I said, very quietly. Jeannie, no, say it again. Paul, because I want to make sure I heard you right. Your mother told me on our patio, before we were even married, that I didn't belong in this family. And you're standing in our kitchen right now telling me she was right. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. You just didn't mean to say it out loud. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the counter to stop it. I have spent 3 years trying to prove I was worth choosing, Paul, not to you. You never once made me feel like I had to her. To everyone in that family who looked at me like I was something you'd eventually grow out of. And I did it quietly, without asking anyone for a single ounce of credit. And the first time I actually build something for myself, you don't ask me a single honest question about it. You just decide, based on what your sister thinks she saw through a car window, that I'm exactly what your mother always said I was. I'm scared, he said, and his voice broke on it, real and raw. I'm scared about the lawsuit. I'm scared I'm going to lose everything my dad spent his whole career building. And I came home, and my wife has secrets I didn't know about. And I didn't know what else to think. Then you should have asked. That's it. That's the whole thing, Paul. You should have asked me before you let your fear pick an answer for you. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. I waited, some small and stubborn part of me still waiting, for him to cross the kitchen and take it back, to say he didn't mean it, to choose me the way he'd chosen me on that pedestrian bridge over Ladybird Lake, with his grandmother's ring shaking in his hand. He didn't move. If that's really what you think of me, I said, after everything, after 3 years of me choosing you and this family every single day, then maybe I never should have believed I could be enough for it in the first place. Maybe your mother's been right about that too. Jeannie, that's not... Don't. I was already moving past him, down the hall, toward Zoe's room, toward a duffel bag I'd pulled from the closet with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Don't you dare stand there and try to walk it back now. He followed me as far as the doorway of the nursery and stopped there, framed in the hall light, watching me lift our sleeping daughter into her car seat with hands that would not stop shaking, buckling the straps by feel, because I couldn't see clearly enough through my own tears to check them twice. It was, in that moment, the only steady thing left in the entire house. The one motion my body still remembered how to do right. He didn't say, "Don't go." He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He just stood there, silent, and I understood in everything he wasn't saying that I already had my answer. Chapter 5. A burden on a fixed income. The divorce took 4 months, which everyone kept telling me was fast, as though speed were the same thing as mercy. We mediated over 3 sessions in a family law office on Barton Springs Road. A mediator named nobody I remember clearly now, because I spent most of those meetings staring at a spot on the conference table rather than at Paul, who sat close enough that I could still smell the same soap he'd always used, which felt like its own particular cruelty. He didn't fight me on custody. I'll say that for him even now. He agreed to the standard arrangement, every other weekend and Wednesday dinners, agreed to child support without a single argument. Agreed to let me keep the house on Avenue F outright, since it had never been marital property to begin with. Just my father's money in my own 2 hands. He signed everything I asked him to sign. He just never once in 4 months of paperwork asked me to stay. During the second session, the mediator asked if either of us wanted to add anything about the reasons for the separation. Purely for the file, she said, not for any legal purpose. Paul opened his mouth like he might finally say something real, something about his sister's phone call, or his own fear, or the specific words he'd used that night in our kitchen. Then he looked down at the folder in front of him instead and said, "Irreconcilable differences." The same flat phrase every other divorcing couple in that building had probably used that same week. And I understood. He'd decided it was easier to let the law's vocabulary carry what he couldn't manage to say in his own. I kept waiting for him to. Every session, some small, stubborn part of me got dressed that morning, half expecting him to show up and say he'd been wrong, that he'd talked to Alexander himself, that his mother's voice in his head had finally lost its argument against the facts. He never did. I understand now that pride works like a bone that's set wrong. It heals eventually, but it heals crooked, and by the time either of us thought to question the shape it had taken, the marriage was already over in every way that mattered. Elizabeth sent a card, an actual card, cream cardstock, her handwriting elegant and final. "Divorce is never easy," it read. "I hope you find peace, Jeannie, and I hope you know we will always consider you Zoe's mother, whatever else has changed." There was no apology in it anywhere, not for the patio warning, not for the Junior League comment, not for the brown nose remark that had started the slow unraveling of a table nobody at that dinner had thought to stop. I understood the card for what it actually was. Relief, dressed up as Grace. I moved into my mother's house in Windsor Park with Zoe, into the bedroom that had been mine growing up. Now repainted a soft yellow for a granddaughter my mother adored without reservation. Caroline Greer had raised me alone since I was 16, working cafeteria service at 3 different Austin ISD campuses over the years, and she opened her door to me and my daughter without a single hesitation, the way you'd expect from a woman who'd built her whole life on the belief that family showed up, no matter the cost. For a while it was almost good. Caroline doted on Zoe, sang to her in the kitchen, while I finished my shifts, staging houses I could no longer afford to live in myself. And some nights, the 3 of us ate dinner at the same scarred oak table I'd grown up doing homework on. And I let myself believe the worst of it was already behind me. My best friend from my design program at Austin Community College, Grace Turner, showed up most Sunday afternoons that fall with a rotisserie chicken from the HEB and a bottle of wine for herself. Since I was still nursing wounds too fresh for alcohol to help much, she'd sit on my mother's back steps while Zoe toddled around the yard chasing grasshoppers, and she never once asked me to explain what had happened with Paul beyond what I volunteered on my own. "You don't owe anybody the story before you're ready to tell it," she said once. And I loved her for that, more than I ever found the right words to say back to her. I finished the Avenue F house alone that winter, in the after-work hours and the exhausted weekends, hauling drywall myself when I couldn't afford another crew, learning to tape and float a seam by watching videos on my phone propped against a paint can. I sold it in February for a profit that made my hands shake when I saw the closing number. Enough to cover 4 months of expenses and put a small cushion back into a savings account that had felt, for over a year, permanently empty. I told myself that was the beginning of something. I didn't yet understand how long a beginning could take to become anything more than that. The strain in my mother's house crept in slowly enough that I almost didn't notice it arriving. The way you don't notice a room getting cold until you're already shivering. Caroline's hours got cut that spring, when the district consolidated cafeteria staff across 2 campuses. Her knees, which had been aching for years, turned out to be early arthritis, bad enough that her doctor recommended she cut back further, advice she couldn't actually afford to take. The light bill came due the same week as Zoe's daycare payment and a car repair Caroline hadn't budgeted for. And I watched my mother, a woman who had never once in my life let me see her afraid, start staying up late at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills arranged by due date. It happened on a Tuesday in April, almost exactly a year after I'd carried Zoe out of my own kitchen for the last time. I came home from a long shift to find Caroline still at that table, the calculator's screen glowing in the dim light, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair. "Jeannie, baby, sit down a minute," she said. "I need to talk to you about something." I sat. Zoe was already asleep in the next room, and something in my mother's voice made my stomach drop before she said another word. "I've been doing the math," she said, "and I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. You and Zoe, on top of everything else? I love you both more than my own life, you know that, but love doesn't pay the light bill, and I am tired, Jeannie. I'm so tired. I'm working every shift they'll give me, Mama. I'm trying. I know you are." "I'm not saying you're not trying." She reached over and took my hand, and her grip was gentle even as her words were not. But a grown daughter and a baby is a heavy load for a woman my age, on what I make now. You need a plan, and you need it fast. Maybe you find someone new, somebody steady, somebody who can help carry this the way Paul used to. Or maybe you go back to him, apologize for whatever needs apologizing, and give that little girl, her family, back whole. I don't know which. I just know something has to give, because I can't keep being the one who gives it. I sat there in my childhood kitchen, in the house that had always been the one unshakable place in my life, and understood, with a clarity that felt like glass breaking somewhere behind my ribs, that I had now been found insufficient by both families I had ever belonged to. You think I'm a burden, I said quietly. I think you're my daughter, and I think you deserve more than what you've got right now. And I don't know how to give it to you myself anymore. Caroline's eyes were wet, and I understood, even through my own devastation, that she meant every word as love, not cruelty. That fear had simply worn her down into saying the one thing a child should never have to hear from her own mother. It didn't make it hurt any less. It just meant there was no one left to blame the way I wanted to blame someone. I didn't cry in front of her. I went into the room I'd grown up in, sat on the edge of the bed beside my sleeping daughter, and made a promise to myself in the dark that I have never once broken since. I would never again build my life on a foundation that depended on someone else deciding I was worth keeping. Whatever I built next, it would be mine entirely, so completely mine that no one would ever again have the power to look at me and my daughter and call us a weight too heavy to carry. I called Grace the next morning before my shift, sitting in my car in the parking lot of the staging warehouse, and told her what my mother had said. My voice flat with an exhaustion that had moved past crying into something quieter and more permanent. She's scared, Jeannie. Scared people say scared things. I know that. I understand that. It doesn't change what it felt like to hear it. No, Grace agreed. It doesn't. So what are you going to do? I looked at myself in the rearview mirror, at the tired, unglamorous face of a 28-year-old woman with $14 in checking and a daughter asleep in a borrowed crib 3 miles away, and I said the only true thing I had left to offer either of us. I'm going to build something so solid nobody ever gets to call it fragile again. Starting today. Chapter 6, 5 Years of Tuesdays. I moved into a 1-bedroom off Rundberg Lane that June, small enough that Zoe's crib fit in the corner of my own room, cheap enough that I could bank most of what the Avenue F sale had left me. I kept my staging job during the day and spent every evening and weekend after that on the second house, a duplex in East Austin that needed new everything. Working alongside a small crew, I paid in cash, I counted. Twice before handing over, Alexander never once brought up what had happened with Paul. He showed up the Saturday after I moved out with a thermos of coffee and a level, set both on the duplex's bare subfloor, and said, "Ready to keep going, or do you need a week?" "I need to keep going," I said. "Standing still is the only thing I can't afford right now. We worked together for 2 more years like that. Him teaching, me learning faster than either of us expected, until the day I stood in his driveway and told him I wanted to buy the next property without him fronting any part of the risk. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I needed to know in my own bones that I could do it without anyone's name attached to mine but my own. That's the whole point. "Jeannie," he said, and I heard something like pride under the words. "I was never trying to build you a safety net. I was trying to teach you how to fall correctly so you wouldn't need one." Zoe grew up watching me work. She learned to write her name at my kitchen table, surrounded by paint swatches instead of coloring books. She started kindergarten at Riley Elementary, the same month I closed on my 3rd property, a bungalow in Cherrywood that I flipped in 4 months and sold for enough profit to finally stop counting cash twice before I handed it to anyone. She rode along in the passenger seat of my work truck to job sites on Saturday mornings, arguing with 6-year-old confidence about which tile was prettier. And more than once, a contractor twice my age took her opinion more seriously than mine until he learned better. On her 6th birthday, I couldn't afford the bounce house rental the other kindergarten parents were doing that year, so I built her a pretend job site in our tiny backyard instead. A stack of real lumber scraps, a toy hard hat Alexander found at a garage sale, a hand-lettered sign that read, "Zoe's Construction Company, established today." She wore that hard hat to bed for a week afterward. Years later, she'd tell people it was the best birthday party she'd ever had. And I believed her, because I'd watched her face that afternoon. And there wasn't a single thing about it that looked like a consolation prize. There were harder years mixed into the good ones, years I don't romanticize looking back, because romanticizing them would insult how hard they actually were. A roof collapse on my 4th project that ate $11,000 I didn't have, and forced me to take a second staging job on weekends to cover it. A winter when Zoe caught pneumonia, and I sat up 3 nights straight in a hospital room at Dell Children's, doing invoices on my phone in the dark because the work didn't stop, just because my daughter was sick, no matter how much I wanted it to. I remember watching the oxygen monitor blink beside her small chest and thinking that if anything happened to her, none of the rest of it, the houses, the money, the proving myself right to anyone, would have meant a single thing. A year I didn't take a single vacation day, didn't buy a single thing for myself that wasn't already broken, because every spare dollar went back into the next project, and the one after that, and the one after that. My relationship with my mother during those years existed in a careful, quiet space neither of us fully knew how to name. We weren't estranged. I still brought Zoe by on Sundays, still called to check on her knees, still sent money when I could spare it, even before I could really afford to. But something had shifted between us that April night, some layer of unguarded trust that hadn't grown back yet, and we both, I think, sensed it wasn't ready to be spoken about directly. We loved each other carefully instead, the way you handle something you're not entirely sure has finished healing. By the time Zoe turned 5, Greer Design Build was a real company, not just a woman with a truck and a level. I had 2 full-time employees, a reputation in the Hyde Park and Cherrywood corridors for finishing on budget and on time, and enough of a track record that when the city put out a request for proposals on a boutique infill parcel in Muller, the old airport redevelopment on the east side, I actually believed I had a real shot at winning it. I didn't win it easily. I spent 6 weeks on that proposal. Nights after Zoe went to bed refining the site plan, the sustainability numbers, the budget projections, until Grace Turner started leaving groceries on my porch because she said I'd stopped remembering to eat. The committee interviewed 4 firms. 3 of the other 3 had partners twice my age and portfolios 10 times the size of mine. I almost didn't submit at all. I remember standing in my kitchen at midnight the night before the deadline, staring at the finished proposal on my laptop, hearing Elizabeth Brown's voice from a dinner table years earlier asking if I'd thought about what I'd do now that I was a Brown. And for one terrible second, I believed her old assessment of me more than I believed my own 5 years of evidence to the contrary. Then I thought about Zoe asleep down the hall, about the hard hat still sitting on her dresser from her 6th birthday. And I hit submit before I could talk myself out of it a second time. I got the call on a Thursday in March, standing in my kitchen with a box of macaroni half-cooked on the stove. And I had to ask the city planner to repeat herself twice before I let myself believe what she was telling me. Greer Design Build had won the Mueller parcel. It became the project that changed everything. 8 townhomes built around a shared courtyard, designed to preserve the character of the old airport hangars in the roofline, while meeting every modern efficiency standard the city required. It took 14 months, more sleepless nights than I could count, a subcontractor dispute that nearly sank the whole timeline, and a local architecture blog write-up that called it, and I still have the printout, quietly, the most thoughtful small development Austin has seen in a decade. The final payment cleared into my business account on a Monday in November, more money moving through my hands at once than I'd ever seen in my life. And I sat in my car in the parking lot outside the bank and cried for exactly 4 minutes, thinking about a 28-year-old woman with $14 in checking, and what she would have said if you told her this was coming. I bought the Lamborghini 3 weeks later, paid cash, no loan, because if there was one thing 5 years of counting other people's cost overruns had taught me, it was that debt was a story you told yourself about a future you couldn't actually guarantee. I didn't buy it to prove anything to anyone. I bought it because 7-year-old Zoe deserved a mother who occasionally let herself want something, just because it was beautiful. And because some stubborn, tired part of the woman who'd once folded onesies into a garbage bag in a parking lot needed, finally, to feel the difference in her own hands. Paul and I had settled, over the years, into a co-parenting rhythm that worked well enough. He came for Zoe every other Friday like clockwork, never late, rarely distracted by his phone during their time together, and I'd long since stopped bracing myself every time his name lit up my screen. We were civil. We were, in the careful way exes with a shared child sometimes eventually become, almost friendly. Two people who had loved each other once and now mostly just loved the same 7-year-old instead. I was still getting used to the sound of that engine, still catching myself smiling every time I started it. When Paul called on a Sunday afternoon in February, his voice careful in a way it hadn't been in years. "Hey," he said, "I know this is a big ask. It's Dad's anniversary party next month, 30 years of Brown Builders. The whole family's going to be there. And Zoe's been asking about it non-stop since Mom mentioned it, and it's my weekend anyway. But I wanted to actually ask you first, not just assume." Something in me softened, just slightly at that last part. "Not just assume, where is it?" I asked. "The Four Seasons downtown." "Nothing crazy, just a family thing that got a little bigger than my parents intended." He paused. "She really wants to go, Jeannie. She keeps talking about seeing her grandpa." I looked out my kitchen window at Zoe doing cartwheels in the backyard. 7 years old and utterly unaware that the answer I was about to give would put her in exactly 19 days. In the middle of the moment that finally cracked both our families open for good. "Of course she can go," I said. "Just take care of her." "I always do," Paul said, and for once I let myself believe him completely. Chapter 7. The car in the valet line. I found out what happened at that party the same way I found out about most things in those years, second-hand and too late to prevent it. Though I've since pieced together enough of it from Zoe, and later from Paul, to tell it now like I was standing in the room myself. The ballroom at the Four Seasons overlooked Lady Bird Lake. Floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the last gold light of a March evening, round tables dressed in cream linen, a banner reading 30 years of building Austin, stretched above a dessert table nobody would touch until the speeches ended. Zoe wore a green dress I'd bought her for the occasion, her hair in the French braid only Paul had ever properly learned to do, and by every account, she spent the first hour of that party glowing, hand in her grandfather's, introducing herself to Brown Builders employees twice her age with the easy confidence of a child who has never once doubted she belongs somewhere. Henry spent much of that hour showing her off properly, introducing her to men he'd worked construction sites with for 3 decades, letting her hold the small silver trowel the mayor's office had presented him that evening for his community redevelopment work. "This one's going to run the company someday," he told anyone who'd listen, only half joking, and Zoe beamed every single time he said it, filing the words away the way children do with the compliments that matter most to them. Henry gave a short toast around 6:30, glass raised, thanking 3 decades of clients, subcontractors, and what he called the stubborn Brown belief that you build a thing right the first time, or you don't build it at all. The room applauded. Paul, standing near his father with one hand resting lightly on Zoe's shoulder, looked for a moment like a man who had everything exactly where it belonged. Elizabeth was holding court, near the bar with 2 women from the Junior League, the same organization she'd once suggested I join. When Zoe wandered close enough to be noticed, and not close enough to be included in the conversation, which was, I've come to understand, exactly the kind of gap Elizabeth Brown had spent her whole life perfecting. "She's gotten so tall," one of the women said. "She favors Paul so much." "Thank goodness," Elizabeth said, not lowering her voice nearly enough. "We really did dodge something there, didn't we? I love the child dearly, but I always did worry what she might have picked up from her mother's side. That whole unfortunate business with the divorce. Some people simply aren't built for a family like ours. And it's better we all found that out sooner rather than later." One of the junior league women laughed. A short, uncomfortable sound, the kind people make when they're not sure whether they're supposed to agree. Samantha, standing just behind her mother's shoulder, said nothing at all, though something crossed her face that looked, to anyone watching closely enough to catch it, uncomfortably close to shame. Zoe was 7 years old. She did not understand every word in that sentence. She understood enough. She found a quiet corner near the coat check, sat down on a bench meant for elderly guests waiting on valets, and pulled her sleeve back from the small GPS watch I'd bought her the year before, the one whose only 2 functions she'd ever needed until that exact moment were telling time and calling Mommy. I was home that evening, halfway through folding a basket of Zoe's laundry while a home renovation show played low on the television. The kind of ordinary Saturday night I'd fought 5 years to be able to afford, when my phone buzzed with her contact photo, a picture of her missing her 2 front teeth and grinning like the whole world was funny. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming a butt dial, the way her calls to me sometimes were. Something made me answer. "Mommy." Her voice was small and thick, with the particular kind of crying kids do when they're trying very hard not to. "Can you come get me, please?" "Baby, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" "No, I just want to go home. Please come get me, please, please." I asked her twice more what happened, and both times she said only that she wanted to leave, that she didn't want to say why on the phone, that she just needed me to come. I've never in my life gotten dressed and out the door faster. I didn't call Paul first, because some instinct older than reason told me his daughter had asked for me specifically, and whatever had happened, she needed to see my face walk through that door before anyone explained it to her in words. I drove downtown with my hands steady on a wheel that had, over the years, become the one place in my life where my hands never once shook, my mind running through every possibility that could make my daughter cry hard enough to call a watch, instead of simply waiting for her father to notice. A fool. A cruel classmate, though there were no classmates at a company anniversary party. By the time I hit the on-ramp downtown, some instinct I couldn't fully name had already landed on the truest possibility, the one I didn't want to be right about. Someone in that family had said something to my daughter that no 7-year-old should have to carry alone in a room full of adults. I pulled up under the Four Seasons portico in the black Lamborghini I'd paid for with 5 years of my own sweat, and I did not think not once about how it would look. I thought about my daughter alone on a bench, asking a stranger's watch to bring her mother. The valet actually stepped back from the car before he stepped toward it, the way people do when something surprises them faster than their manners can catch up. I didn't notice. I was already moving through the lobby doors, already scanning the ballroom entrance for a small girl in a green dress. I found her exactly where she said she'd be, and she was off the bench and running before I'd even fully knelt down, arms locked around my neck so tight I nearly lost my balance in my heels. She smelled like the hotel's lavender hand soap and faintly like the vanilla body spray Grace had given her for her birthday, and underneath both of those, still like my daughter, the particular smell I would have known blindfolded in a room of 1,000 children. "I've got you," I said into her hair. "I've got you, baby. I'm here." That is when the room noticed. I felt it more than saw it at first, a kind of pressure change, conversation thinning out near us in a spreading ring, the way it does when something unexpected enters a space. Somewhere behind me I heard a woman murmur, Is she driving that?" And another voice, lower, answer, "That's Jeannie, Paul's ex-wife." I heard, She started some kind of construction company. The words construction company came out of that stranger's mouth like she still wasn't sure she believed them, like the sentence required more faith than the evidence in front of her currently allowed. I looked up over Zoe's shoulder and found Elizabeth Brown standing with a champagne flute frozen an inch from her lips, staring at me like she was trying to reconcile the woman kneeling in front of her with whoever she'd expected to walk through that door. I found Samantha beside her, mouth slightly open. I found Henry further back, breaking into something that looked, against everything else happening in that room, almost like a smile, and I found Paul, already crossing the floor toward us. His face doing something complicated I didn't have time to read before he dropped to a crouch in front of his daughter. "Zoe, sweetheart, what happened? Why did you call Mom?" Zoe went quiet for a second, glancing between her father's face and mine, the particular hesitation of a child deciding whether telling the truth will make things better or worse. Paul must have seen it too, because he softened his voice further, the voice he saved only for her. "You can tell me. Whatever it is, you can tell me." Zoe pulled back from me just far enough to look at her father directly, her chin doing the small, determined thing it did when she decided something and wasn't going to be talked out of it. "Grandma said, Mommy's people aren't good enough for us," she said, her voice carrying further than a 7-year-old's voice has any right to in a quiet room. "But Mommy built her whole company by herself. She built houses, Daddy. She built a company from nothing, and you never even asked her how she did it. You never asked her anything. Grandma said it, and you didn't say she was wrong." The silence that followed felt longer than it probably was. Paul looked up at me then, over his daughter's shoulder, and for the first time in 5 years, I watched every certainty he'd built his life around since our divorce come apart behind his eyes. Right there in the middle of his father's 30-year celebration, with half the room still watching and nobody, for once, quite sure what was supposed to happen next. Somewhere behind him, I heard Elizabeth's champagne glass finally complete its journey to the table, set down with a small, unsteady clink that in that silence sounded loud as a verdict. Chapter 8. The Notebook. Paul called 2 days after the party, his voice careful in a way that told me he'd rehearsed the words before dialing. "Can we talk?" "Not about us. About Zoe, and about what she said." "I need to understand it, Jeannie, and I think I need to hear it from you. Not from a 5-year-old memory I've been telling myself a version of ever since. We met at my office on East Cesar Chavez, a converted warehouse space I'd leased the year before. Exposed brick and the smell of fresh-cut pine, still lingering from a mock-up we'd built for a client the week before. I watched him take it in. The framed photos of finished projects on the wall, the Mueller courtyard renderings still pinned above my drafting table. And something in his face rearranged itself slowly, like a man recalculating a math problem he'd been certain he'd already solved correctly years ago. He stopped in front of a photograph of the Mueller courtyard at golden hour. A row of children's bicycles leaned against a bench I'd insisted on installing myself when the budget nearly cut it. "This is beautiful, Jeannie," he said quietly. "I mean that. I had no idea. Any of it. You never asked," I said, and I didn't say it unkindly, just factually. "The way you'd note the weather. I still have it," I said before he could speak, and pulled a battered spiral notebook from the bottom drawer of my desk. Avenue F, every meeting with Alexander, every date, every dollar. I kept it because Alexander told me to document everything, for the bank, for the permits. I never once imagined I'd need it for this. I set it on the table between us and didn't push it toward him. He had to reach for it himself. He read for a long time. I watched him find the entry from the night of Zoe's dinner, Alexander's card, a phone number in blue ink. I watched him find the date he'd have recognized as the week he was drowning in the Riverside Commons deposition. Notes in my handwriting about foundation costs and drainage easements. A sketch of the Avenue F floor plan with measurements in the margin. I watched him get to a page, dated the same week Samantha called him. A short entry that read only, "Told A," about the inspector's mistake today. Cried a little from relief. He held onto my shoulder a second too long, and I let him because I needed someone to be proud of me, and Paul is too tired lately to notice. He closed the notebook and didn't say anything for a long moment. I could have asked you, he said finally. That's the whole thing, isn't it? 5 years, and it comes down to one sentence. I could have just asked you, yes, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't undo any of it. I know Zoe, standing in that ballroom saying what she said, means I failed her for years before I ever understood I was doing it. But I am sorry, Jeannie, more than I know how to put into words that don't sound cheap after everything. You don't get to just be sorry and have that fix it. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Do you understand what the last 5 years have actually been? Do you understand what your mother's voice sounded like in my head every single time something went wrong on a job site? Because some small, stupid part of me thought maybe she'd been right about me all along? I built an entire company partly to prove a dead argument wrong, Paul. That is not something an apology unbuilds. I know. I don't think you do. I don't think you can. Not yet. And I'm not saying that to punish you. I'm saying it because it's true. And I promised myself a long time ago I would never again let someone's comfort matter more than my own honesty. He nodded. And for once, he didn't try to argue his way out of the discomfort of just sitting in it. That, more than the apology itself, was the first thing that made me believe something in him might have actually changed. He went to his parents' house that same evening, still raw from our conversation, and told me about it 2 days later, though I didn't ask him to. He found his mother in the kitchen and asked her directly why she'd said what she said to Zoe. I was protecting this family's name, Elizabeth told him, not even looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. Someone in this house has always had to. I won't apologize for caring what people think of us, Paul. Caring about that is the reason this family has anything left to protect at all. You hurt my daughter. Your daughter is 7. She'll forget it by next week, she won't. And even if she did, that's not the point, Mom. The point is you said it, in front of half of Dad's company, about a woman who built something extraordinary while we were all busy deciding she wasn't worth believing. Elizabeth set down her knife. For a moment something flickered across her face, something that might have been the start of real reckoning and then closed again. The way a door closes when someone decides, consciously, that opening it isn't worth what's on the other side. I did what I thought was right at the time, she said. I still believe most of it. Do you know what my own mother told me the week before I married your father? Elizabeth said suddenly, not looking up from the cutting board. That I was marrying beneath what our family had built, that the Browns were construction money, new money, nothing like what she'd hoped for me. I spent 30 years proving her wrong by becoming exactly the kind of woman she'd have approved of instead. I don't expect you to understand that. I'm not certain I fully understand it myself. For a moment, Paul almost softened. Then he thought of Zoe's face in that ballroom, and didn't. Then Zoe doesn't come to family events until you figure out which parts you're willing to unbelieve, Paul told her, and walked out before she could answer. Henry standing frozen in the hallway doorway, having heard enough of it to understand, for the first time in 30 years of marriage, exactly how much his silence had been costing everyone around him too. I had my own reckoning that same week. I drove to my mother's house on a Thursday evening, Zoe safely at a friend's birthday party, and sat down across from Caroline at the same scarred oak table where she'd once told me I was too heavy to carry. I need to say something out loud that I've never said to you directly, I told her. What you said to me that night about being a burden, it broke something in me, Mama. I built my entire life afterward around never hearing those words again from anyone, including you. And I don't think I ever told you that plainly, because I was too scared of what it would do to us if I did. Caroline's eyes filled immediately. I've hated myself for that conversation every day since I had it, she said. I was so frightened, Jeannie. My knees, the bills, feeling like I was failing you at the one moment you needed me most. And instead of telling you I was scared, I told you that you were the problem. I have never forgiven myself for it. I didn't think you'd ever want to hear that from me. So I just let the silence sit there instead, hoping it would somehow heal on its own. It didn't. No, Caroline said quietly. I don't imagine it did. I want to do better, Caroline said. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet. But I don't want to be one more person in your life who made you feel like you had to earn the right to be loved. Then let's figure it out as we go, I said. Slowly. I'm not asking you to fix 5 years in one Thursday night. She reached across the table and took my hand. The same hand she'd held the night she'd broken something in me without meaning to. And this time neither of us let go first. We sat with that for a long moment, the two of us, in a kitchen that had once felt like the only unshakable place in my life and had since become something more complicated. Something we were both, apparently, still learning how to stand in together. I drove home that night with the notebook still in my bag, Elizabeth's unfinished apology still hanging somewhere over the whole Brown family, like weather that hadn't decided whether to break, and my mother's tears still fresh enough that I could feel them behind my own eyes. Every relationship I'd spent 5 years learning to survive without had cracked open in the same single week, and none of them, not one, had offered me anything close to resolution yet. I sat in my driveway a long time before I went inside, wondering for the first time since I'd bought that ridiculous, beautiful car, whether building a life strong enough to survive without anyone else's belief had also, somewhere along the way, built me a life too armored to let anyone back in, even the ones who were finally trying. Chapter 9. Earning It Back. Paul didn't ask me for anything in the weeks that followed. That, more than any single gesture, was what I noticed first. He showed up for Zoe every Friday at exactly 5, never once late, never once distracted by his phone during their time together. The way he'd started to be in the last stretch of our marriage when Riverside Commons was eating him alive. He came to her school's spring showcase and sat in a folding chair in the back row without making it about himself, without lingering afterward to talk to me longer than a simple thank you for coming required. When Zoe got strep throat in April, he drove to my house at 11 at night with children's Tylenol from an all-night pharmacy on Airport Boulevard, handed it to me at the door and left without asking to come in. He was, in every way I could measure, simply present. Not performing presence for my benefit, just there, consistently, in the unglamorous, unwitnessed way that actually means something. Zoe noticed it before I let myself fully trust it. Daddy doesn't check his phone at dinner anymore, she told me one night, unprompted, over her own plate of spaghetti. He used to do it a lot. Now he doesn't. I didn't say much back except that I was glad, but I filed the observation away carefully. The way you file evidence in a case you're still deciding whether to believe. The real test came at a family dinner in May, one Henry had specifically asked Paul to attend. A quiet dinner meant to talk through some long, simmering tension that had settled over the family since the party. I wasn't there. Paul told me about it 2 days later over coffee, in a tone that suggested he was still turning it over in his own mind. Elizabeth had brought up Zoe again, carefully, testing whether the ban on family events still held. She's my only granddaughter, she'd said. Surely we can find our way back to something normal. Normal isn't the goal, Mom, Paul told her. Better is the goal, and better means you actually saying out loud that what you said to her was wrong, not managing the consequences of it, actually owning it. Henry, who had said almost nothing since the party, finally spoke. She's right to hold the line, Elizabeth. I should have held it years ago myself. I'd let you run this family's opinions because it was easier than arguing with you. And I let Paul carry a lawsuit that nearly broke him without once asking if his marriage was breaking too. That's on me as much as anyone, maybe more. Elizabeth didn't apologize that night, not fully, not in the clean, complete way either of them wanted. But she went quiet for a long time, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had lost some of its practiced polish. I don't know how to be the kind of mother who admits she was wrong, she said. I was never taught how. That isn't an excuse. It's just the truth, and I suppose I have to start learning it somewhere. Samantha spoke up then, for the first time all evening, her voice unsteady. I need to say something too. I told you what I saw at that house in Hyde Park, because some part of me wanted it to be true, Paul. I never fully examined why. I think I was jealous of how easily Jeannie made a place for herself in this family, and I let that jealousy dress itself up as concern. I'm not proud of it. I called her last week to apologize directly, actually, but I hadn't worked up the nerve to say it here yet. Paul later told me he hadn't expected that from his sister, and neither, if I'm honest, had I, when Samantha's call came through on a Tuesday evening. Awkward and overdue and entirely sincere. We didn't become close overnight, but it was a start neither of us had asked for, and both of us eventually were grateful to receive. It wasn't everything. Paul told me that plainly, sitting across from me with his coffee going cold. It's not a real apology yet, but it's the first true thing I've heard her say about any of this, and I think maybe it's a door starting to open instead of staying shut. I believed him cautiously. The way you believe a weather forecast that's been wrong before, but not always. The second thing that moved something in me happened without Paul's involvement at all, which is, I think, exactly why it mattered so much. Henry called my office directly in June. No preamble, no mention of family history. The old Hancock building on East 11th, he said. City wants it restored, not demolished. Mixed income units above, ground floor retail. It needs someone who understands historic character, not just square footage. I'm not calling because you're my former daughter-in-law, Jeannie. I'm calling because I've seen what you built at Muller, and I think you're the best firm in this city for the job. The selection committee doesn't know you have any connection to this family at all. I made sure of that. I submitted a blind proposal, scored on merit by a 5-person panel who had no idea whose company they were reading. Greer Design Build won it outright, beating out 2 firms with twice my staff and 3 times my years in the business. Paul found out at a project kickoff meeting 3 weeks later, walking into a conference room at Brown Builders' offices to discover his own father had brought on a subcontracting design partner for the Hancock restoration, and that partner was me. I watched him sit through an hour-long presentation on structural preservation and modern retrofitting. Watched him ask sharp, genuinely engaged questions about load calculations and historic tax credits. Watched him look at me, for the first time maybe ever, as a professional equal instead of someone he needed to protect or explain or apologize to. Afterward, in the parking lot, he caught up to me at my car. "You didn't need my dad to hand you that," he said. "You'd have gotten there eventually anyway." "I know that now. I know it too," I said. "But it still matters that he did it the right way, blind, on merit. No favors. He's trying," Paul said, "in his own late clumsy way. We all are. Even you?" I asked, "especially me. I'm the one who had the least excuse and did the most damage. If anyone in this family needs to prove something through actions instead of words, it's me, not my mother. I've noticed," I said. And I let myself smile, small and real. The first one I'd given him in 5 years that wasn't for Zoe's benefit or the world's. My relationship with my mother had settled, in those same weeks, into something steadier than it had been since before the divorce. I started helping her financially, not because she asked, but because I finally could, and because doing it from a place of choice instead of obligation felt entirely different than the version of dependence I'd once feared. I paid off the last of her car repair bill without telling her until it was done. I took her to a specialist about her knees, one she'd never have been able to afford on her own, and sat with her through the appointment, holding her hand the way she used to hold mine at every doctor's visit of my childhood. "You didn't have to do all this," she told me afterward. "In the parking lot of the orthopedic clinic." "I know," I said. "I wanted to. There's a difference, and I think it took me 33 years to understand what it actually feels like." By the end of June, Paul asked me to dinner. Not a family thing, not a Zoe pickup, disguised as an excuse to linger. An actual dinner, just the 2 of us, at a restaurant on South Congress neither of us had ever been to together, someplace with no history attached to it at all. I sat with the invitation for 2 full days before I answered. I talked it through with Grace on her back porch. The same porch where she'd once shown up with rotisserie chicken and unasked questions during the hardest year of my life. "You don't owe him a yes," she said. "But you don't owe yourself a no out of fear either. Those are 2 different things, and only you know which one you're actually feeling." I thought about that for a long time, turning it over the way I used to turn Alexander's business card over in my fingers on the drive home years ago, before I understood what it would cost me to learn how to build something entirely my own. Yes, I finally wrote back. "But Paul, I need you to understand something before we do this. I'm not coming because I need you. I built a life that doesn't need saving, and I'm proud of every hard year it took to get there. I'm coming because Zoe still looks at you like you hung the moon, and because some mornings lately, when I forget to be angry, so do I. If we do this, you keep earning it. Every ordinary day. Not just the big ones." He wrote back 4 words, and they were, for the first time in 5 years, exactly enough. I can do that. Chapter 10. An Ordinary Tuesday. We didn't get married again that year or the year after. I want to be honest about that, because honesty is the only thing either of us has left to offer that actually means something. What we got instead was smaller and slower, and I've come to believe worth more than a wedding would have been that soon. Paul and I had dinner on South Congress that June, and it was awkward in the particular way 2 people who used to know everything about each other are awkward when they're relearning it on purpose, instead of by accident. We talked about Zoe mostly, and brown builders, and the Hancock restoration. And somewhere around dessert, he asked if he could see me again, not as a co-parenting logistics meeting, but as an actual date. And I said yes before I could talk myself into overthinking it. We took it slowly after that. Dinner every other week became dinner every week became, eventually, a standing Tuesday night that Zoe started calling, without any prompting from either of us, Mom and Dad's night. He never once tried to rush it toward anything bigger than what it honestly was in any given month. When I needed distance, he gave it without sulking. When I finally, months later, let him kiss me again for the first time since the divorce, standing in my own driveway under a porch light I'd installed myself, he pulled back afterward and said, quietly, "I'm not in a hurry, Jeannie." I already learned what happens when I rush the important things. Elizabeth came to Zoe's 7th birthday party that August, the first family event she'd attended since the ban, and she brought a gift that wasn't showy or expensive, just a set of children's architecture blocks that Zoe genuinely loved, and she sat on the edge of the yard for most of the afternoon, watching more than talking, the way people do when they're still learning the shape of a room they used to think they owned. She didn't say much to me directly, but when she left, she paused at the gate and said, "The Hancock building looks remarkable, Jeannie. I drove past it last week. You should be very proud. It wasn't everything." It was, from Elizabeth Brown, close enough to enough that I let myself accept it as a start. Caroline comes to Sunday dinner now every week, and last month she finally let me pay for the knee surgery a doctor had been recommending for 2 years, not because she'd run out of pride, but because she'd finally understood that letting your daughter help you isn't the same thing as being a burden to her. We talk more honestly now than we ever did before that Thursday in my kitchen. Some wounds, it turns out, don't close by pretending they never opened. They close by both people agreeing to keep looking at them together, gently, for as long as it takes. On an ordinary Tuesday in September, Paul came for dinner the way he always did now, and Zoe insisted, the way 7-year-olds insist on things with the full force of their entire small bodies, that we eat on the back porch, even though it was getting too cool for it, because she wanted to watch the sun go down over the yard where I'd once built her a pretend construction site out of scrap lumber and a garage sale hard hat. Paul brought limes, an entire bag of them unprompted, set on the counter without a word. Exactly the way he had 9 years earlier in a half-finished model home off Slaughter Lane. And when I caught him doing it, he just shrugged, a little sheepish, like a man who'd finally remembered the language he used to speak fluently before fear taught him to forget it. "For the chicken," he said. "Or nothing. I just saw them at the store and thought of you." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I just squeezed one over the pan on the stove and let the smell of it fill the kitchen the way it had filled a dozen kitchens over a dozen years. Imperfect and specific and entirely ours. Later on the porch, Zoe fell asleep against my shoulder halfway through dinner, worn out from a full day of being 7. And Paul reached over and brushed a strand of hair off her face with the same careful gentleness I remembered from a recovery room at St. David's Medical Center. Years before either of us had any idea what we would eventually survive to get back to this exact kind of quiet. "I keep thinking about that notebook," he said low so he wouldn't wake her. "How close I came to never knowing what was actually in it. How close I came to spending the rest of my life certain of the wrong story. But you didn't," I said. "You asked eventually. Late, but you asked. Is late enough?" I looked at my daughter, asleep and safe, and utterly unaware that she was the reason any of this healing had started at all. And I looked at the man across from me, still imperfect, still learning, still showing up anyway. "One ordinary Tuesday at a time. Ask me again in a year," I said. "Ask me again every year if you have to. That's the whole deal now, Paul. Nobody gets to just assume anything about me ever again. Not you, not your mother, not even my own mother. You want to know something about my life, you ask. Every single time. Every single time," he agreed. "I can do that." Outside, the porch light I'd installed with my own hands 3 years before caught the last of the evening color over the yard, and somewhere down the street a neighbor's dog barked at nothing in particular, and my daughter slept warm against my side, and for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, none of us were bracing for whatever came next. We were simply finally home.